Welcome to this revision video on women in America, focusing particularly on women in World War II and then women in the 1950s. I'm going to do a separate video on women in the 1960s, although those three time periods could all link together. But I'm just going to focus on women and how World War II changed life for them. These are the kind of three images that we'd have of women and how they were changing in American society in the time periods that we're looking at. So 1940s, we've got the impact of World War II. In the 1950s, they then start to regress slightly, and all the progress that they made during World War II, they have to kind of take a step back from that, and they become the traditional housewife. And then in the 1960s, there's a movement of women's rights that takes place, but like I said, I'm going to do that as a separate shorter video. So let's just briefly talk about women before World War II, because remember our topic on America starts in 1929, so that we know in the 1920s has been a period of significant change for women. If you're thinking about Germany as well, do you remember how women were getting more freedom? They were allowed to go out on their own, go drinking, wearing more makeup, the fashions for shorter dresses and skirts, and we have those flapper ladies that we kind of see. Now in America, obviously, they have a bit more freedom in America, and they were taking that to more extremes, especially as you had the Roaring Twenties with the Jazz Age and the speakeasies where people were drinking illegal liquor. You could imagine that women were being allowed to go out to these places on their own and dress in a more risque way. But that doesn't mean that everybody in 1920s and 1930s America was a flapper. Women were still supposed to have the traditional role, that is of a mother and a wife. So it was still something that most women in America, especially if they didn't live in, Chicago or New York or big cities, they were mostly mothers, stay-at-home mothers. That doesn't mean that everybody in America was a stay-at-home mother though, or a flapper. If you were from working class or for a poorer background, it depended. Sometimes you needed money, you and your husband both needed money, so you would have to go out and work and be a mother and a wife all at the same time. Now the jobs that were available to women in the 1930s were mainly feminine roles, so office work, being a secretary, typing, taking notes, making phone calls, a nurse, a teacher, a cleaner, roles that were, caring based and things that women would be doing already, looking after children and so on. They wouldn't be having high paid manly jobs. That was the job for the men. And of course, as soon as you got married, you were probably expected to give up your job. There were some women who had part-time work, but really once you were married, you were supposed to give up working. That brings us to World War II, and this is where things are going to start to change massively for women. That's mainly because the men are away fighting. If men are away fighting, that means that there are more jobs available, and employers are kind of forced to employ women because they're the only workforce that are left. So women start to replace men in these more manly roles that they wouldn't have put women in before. So, for example, working in a shipyard or on an aircraft factories making airplanes. So you can see the top two pictures there on the side. You've got two women working on building aircraft. So they're using heavy machinery, drills, they have to wear trousers, especially the woman at the top. She's an African American woman, so it's important to know that they were employing black women as well. And if you think women didn't have much opportunity in America, and if you were a black woman, you had even less opportunity in America. So they were starting to employ black women as well. There was also demand for weapons because obviously they're at war, so this gave working class women especially new roles in making munitions, and you can see the women at the bottom there, they're soldering bullets or bombs or something. It was mainly a working class women's role because it was dirty, grimy work, heavy lifting. You can see lots of pictures of women sort of cranking heavy machinery and things like that. So it wasn't really something that middle class or upper class women were expected to do. But that was good because it gave working class women an opportunity that they needed. Munitions pay was actually the best paid job that a woman could have during World War II, and I think that's because it was essential war work that they needed doing. Women also joined the armed forces, so particularly the Navy, nursing corps, which is like the nursing branch of the army. So you would have women walking around in military uniform as well. All of this was giving women a new sense of freedom because they were being paid and men were away, and it was considered more important to be contributing to the war through work than being a wife and being a mother and having children. So there was less pressure on women to go and get married. So you have lots of women in the 1940s who were going out, spending their money, working hard, and then, you know, partying hard, and not having this pressure of having to go home and cook and clean and look for a husband. It was a new sense of freedom, and most women really took to that sense of independence and really enjoyed the freedom that the war had given them. Here's a famous poster, a propaganda poster from the 1940s in America. It's called Rosie the Riveter. She's a character. She's been made up, but she was actually based on some photographs that the government had seen of women in overalls with their pretty little headscarves on their head, but they were getting down to serious work and they were showing their mental and physical strength. So they came up with this character called Rosie the Riveter. Riveter's like a type of work that you do in a factory. So I'm just picking out some bits from this poster that show you how women are being portrayed by the government and they're therefore being seen by other people in American society. So they've got overalls on, which are for function, not there to look pretty, not wearing dresses and skirts and things like that. She's showing her muscles, which shows that she's strong, and she's physically rolling up her sleeves, which means that she's doing some serious work and she's, rolling up her sleeves and contributing to the war. We can do it is including all women, and it's showing that women are a crucial part of the war. It's almost as if they're saying, we can matter too, we can do what the boys can do. So it's a very important piece of propaganda here. What happens after the war then? Remember, the war didn't finish until 1945, so I'm not going to jump straight into the 50s just yet. Most women, actually, when the war was over and the men came home, willingly gave up their jobs. They knew that they would be part-time jobs, and when the war was over they would go home. Most of them were happy to do so, go back to being a wife and a mother once the soldiers had returned from the war. However, if you did stay on, or if you tried to get a different job, men were favoured over most jobs. If you were to go and interview, they would give the job to the man. And this is especially for jobs that required further education, further training, and generally a higher pay. So it kind of went back to the way it was of women doing secretarial work and teaching, the jobs that they were doing before the war. Women were earning 50% less than men, even if they were doing the same job, and women could be dismissed, fired if they got married. So I'm imagining this is why a lot of women willingly gave up their job, because they kind of thought, it's kind of not worth it, I'm going to fight for this job and not be paid as much as the man, and I could just be fired if I decide that I want a family, if I fall in love and get married. So I think, especially if you already had a husband, I think most women were going back to being a housewife, and then others, it was just very difficult to maintain the job that they'd had after the war. And then we have the 1950s, which is a decade, like I said, where this tough, independent, free woman image that we had in the 40s starts to take a step backwards. And we have the 1950s American housewife. Pretty pink skirt, hair perfect, full lot of makeup on, while they're doing the housework in their high heels. Now, advertisement plays a massive role in this. In the 1950s, because of the success of propaganda, we have advertising when the television is just in its infancy. Maybe the 60s is bigger for television adverts, but in the 1950s you definitely get a lot of posters. So media is encouraging women to do the traditional role of being a wife and being a mother. You can see in the two pictures up at the top, one's got a washing machine, one is cooking. At the bottom there, she's got like a feather duster in her hand, so she's been cleaning, and she's got an apron on. So all of these are advertising things and secretly saying to women, this is where you are, this is the image that we have of you, this is where you should be. Particularly like the beer advert, where she's burnt the dinner, but at least she hasn't burnt the beer, kind of suggesting that women are stupid. The economy is doing well in the 1950s because of how well it did during the war. So this means that there are more middle-class women. So women are wealthier, their husbands are wealthier, and they were moving to places called the suburbs, which are on the outskirts of cities. So you have houses with your own garden and you drive for your car and things like that. Now, it was away from the city, which means that for some women it was really boring because they just stayed in the house all day and there wasn't anywhere else really to go. But at the same time, more women were driving than ever before. They had the creation of supermarkets that were built like on the side of motorways and things, rather than having to go to a fresh fruit and veg stall every day. So in some ways, life was easier for women because of things like hoovers, ovens, washing machines, driving to convenience stores. But then in other ways, it was quite boring life. They did have some sense of freedom. So these new appliances like washing machines and hoovers meant that some women were being kept at home, but the housework was quicker. So some women were actually doing part-time work because they had time on their hands. So some women got freedom, and then sometimes it was a bad thing. Another thing that gave women freedom is the contraceptive pill became more widely available, which gave women the choice of when they had children, so they could put having children off to go and pursue a career if they wanted to. So in some respects, women did have freedom. They also were better educated in the 1950s. There was a spike in women attending university. So you can see in the corner there's women at university. You'd have like sororities as well. So like sisterhoods, groups where women would live and study together, and that gives women better opportunities at getting well-paid jobs. So they were starting the race that was catching up to men. It's going to be a slow one, but in the 50s is where it's kind of beginning education-wise. So overall, how women's roles did they change over those 20 years or so? So women had little rights or independence before World War II. They'd only recently got the vote in the 1920s, and even so it was, you'd only allowed to vote if you had a husband or a house or something like that. Then comes World War II. Women saw that they were capable of doing the men's jobs, and they had a great sense of freedom with their wage. Little changed for women after the war, however. They were not being paid the same as men, for example. And then in the 1950s, it saw women mainly being housewives in the suburbs, although in some respects you could say life was becoming easier. So it's a bit of an up and down ride for women. It's not fair to say that after the war everything was bad, but it's probably safe to say that the 1940s was the best time to be a woman in America, unless you count, obviously, later on in the 20th century. Here are a couple of questions that you might want to use to revise the impact of the Second World War on women's lives. Thank you for listening.